We are going to move on to the next lesson. I was joking with Clint and Richard this morning. I said, man, reading some of these bios, you almost need a PhD to read them. You laugh, just wait until I read this. Dr. Miller holds multiple degrees, including an earned PhD in biomechanical engineering from Auburn University, with an emphasis in navigation and control of biological systems. He has published research internationally in peer-reviewed technical science journals and is an active member of several science societies. While at Auburn University, he also instructed courses in thermodynamics, fluid mechanics, and heat transfer, as well as statics and dynamics. He has participated in several creation geological expeditions with leading creation geologists studying seismites, dinosaur fossil beds, and the Grand Canyon, and is currently studying hypogene speleogenesis in North American caves. Now, I'm going to tell you what that means. You can actually Google it like I did. He currently serves as the full-time science writer for Apologetics Press, as well as the associate editor of the monthly Christian Evidences journal, Reason and Revelation. He also serves as an instructor for the Bear Valley Bible Institute, teaching Christian evidences. Dr. Miller is the author of several books, including Science versus Evolution, Flooded, and The Way He Should Go, and Dating Without Detonating. He's married to Julie and has 5 children. And so with that, I will sit down and Dr. Miller will come up. Oh, I was supposed to do this too. There he is. And there's the lesson.
Yeah, we talk about all those credentials and all, but the bulk of us here don't really care anything about that stuff. It's really a means to an end, We have to be all things to all people, and probably our biggest critics that we hear from are people that say that creationists aren't qualified, they can't talk about any of this stuff, and so that's really the only reason that I consider it important to even state any of those credentials. Otherwise, they really don't matter. It's just a bunch of initials after our names. All right, many people don't realize how much the Bible has to say about the value of engaging in science. I've heard people say that, science and religion, they don't really have anything to do with each other. The word science may not appear in the Bible, but that doesn't mean the Bible doesn't actually have a lot to say about science and even strongly encourage the practice of science. So think about, for example, Genesis 1:28. The command is given that humans are supposed to subdue and have dominion over the earth. Isn't that exactly what science is really all about? Psalm 111:2, the works of the Lord are great, studied by all who have pleasure in them. So studying the great works of the Lord, like creation and the flood, that's something we're supposed to do. Romans 1:20, our thematic verse for this week, you can look at the things that are made and come to some conclusions about God, even the nature of God. Psalm 19:1 indicates that through astronomy, you can learn about the glory of God. God actually has Adam carry out biological classification in Genesis 2, so instituting the whole field of biology there. Job 38-40, God responds to Job's demands by giving him a science lesson covering many disciplines of science. Jesus consistently uses things in nature as illustrations. These are things that could only be understood because humans have engaged in science. So science is not something to be feared. It isn't something to be ignored. It's clearly important to God. In fact, God himself instituted the whole discipline of science. So with these things in mind, does the fossil record support creation or evolution? Does it disprove creation in the Bible? When I was in junior high and high school in the 90s, I was very intimidated by the fossil record because there really wasn't a lot out there from our side, and so it was said to support evolution, and I just really didn't know a lot about it. I wasn't hearing many things on that, and what I was hearing seemed maybe insufficient in response to what I was hearing, or at least possibly insufficient, because they seemed that the things that I was hearing may be superficial arguments for all I knew, arguments for which deeper study might reveal their weakness, and so I really didn't know what to do with the fossil record. Now, amazingly, after several years of studying the fossil record and the geologic column, literally digging into the fossil record in some cases, I've actually found the fossil record really to be one of the strongest arguments against evolution and for what the Bible teaches about the flood, for example. And I have an article on this subject on our website, which we've turned into a track as well, which we have available back there on the table for purchase. And then a lot of this material is available in abbreviated form with teens in mind in my new book, Flooded, if you want more information. So let's dig into the evidence. Obviously, we're going to be dealing with a lot of scientific matters in this session because we're talking about the fossil record, and we're going to be talking about these things as they relate to Scripture. So I want to start by defining some terms that I'll be using in this session, which if I didn't explain them, it might make it difficult for some of you to understand what I'm talking about if you've never really looked at this much. So paleontology, first of all, is the discipline that involves the study of fossils. And so first of all, you need to know what a fossil is. A fossil is the leftover of a living organism, typically preserved as rock or in rock. And so we're talking bones and trees and tree trunks and insects and plants and footprints. And so this isn't the original like bone or tree, but more the shape of it that is preserved like an imprint, so a cast or a mold. So an empty impression of a bone or a tree trunk might be left. That's what we call a mold fossil. And if that empty impression is then filled with sediment or minerals and then turns to stone, it is what we call a cast fossil. So some fossils are called body fossils, where the actual body part or shape is preserved as a cast or mold, and some fossils are called what we call trace fossils. This is where, like for example, the tracks, the footprints of an organism, or the activity of an organism is preserved, like bite marks and burrows and even dung. Now the fossil record is then all of these fossils that have been preserved in the rock layers that we find in the earth. So how do these fossils form? So conventional thinking today, so evolutionary thinking in geology holds that, to the assumption of what we call uniformitarianism. Uniformitarianism is the idea that the present is the key to understanding the past. So whatever geological processes you see going on today, so volcanoes forming, canyons eroding, mud and sediment piling up, mountains growing, continents moving, whatever geological processes you see going on today, you assume they've always gone on in that same basic way in the past. So if something is not happening today, then uniformitarianism would assume that it never happened. So global flood, supernatural creation, those things don't happen today, and so it is assumed that they never happen, according to conventional thinking. So Bible believers would say that the present isn't the key to the past, but in the words of geologist Dr. Andrew Snelling, who's a creation geologist, he said really that the past is the key to understanding the present. And so sudden, short-lived, catastrophic, potentially worldwide impacting events have to be considered if they could have affected affect today our interpretation of geological features. So this is what we call catastrophism in geology, and this is definitely the biblical approach to understanding geology. Notice, for example, 2 Peter chapter 3, knowing this first, that scoffers will come in the last days, walking according to their own lusts, and saying, where's the promise of his coming? For since the fathers fell asleep, all things continue as they were from the beginning of creation. For this they willfully forget that by the word of God the heavens were of old, and the earth standing out of water and in the water, by which the world that then existed perished, being flooded with water. So Peter highlights that since miraculous activity on God's part would become scarce, some would begin forgetting about God's amazing works in the past and start having a uniformitarian mindset. The things happening today have always gone on in that way throughout time, and we don't see miracles happening today. So the present is the key to the past. Enormous catastrophic events caused by an alleged God never happened. And so Peter responds by highlighting the greatest catastrophic event that God ever worked, and that is the flood. And since the flood happened, then uniformitarianism will not be the correct approach at understanding the world because it's a major catastrophic event. So which approach is right? Well, amazingly, the mere existence of the fossil record is powerful testimony of catastrophic activity, because catastrophic conditions are necessary in order for something to fossilize. So think about it. What happens to an animal today whenever it dies? So think of roadkill, for example. What happens to that? Does it turn into a fossil? No, it doesn't turn into a fossil. It decays. It's eaten by insects and scavengers. It doesn't fossilize. So think about footprints that you make in the mud or sand. What happens to them? Well, they get washed away by rain or wiped away by wind or water. They don't turn into trace fossils. So how do fossils form? Well, let's think about a cast fossil. So this is when a bone has become rock, usually through a process that we call permineralization. So in order for that to happen, a creature or a bone has to be quickly buried by something like mud, lava, tar, sap, tree sap, and it has to be buried deep enough and thoroughly enough that it's protected from most water, oxygen, scavengers, and microorganisms that would break it down. The fleshy parts of the organism then decay and dissolve over time, but the harder parts, like bone and teeth, are going to decay more slowly. And in fact, they decay slowly enough that as the bone decays and then dissolves and then water seeps through the ground and washes those parts away, the tiny spaces that are then left are filled with minerals that are in the water. And so the bone is gradually completely replaced by minerals, and a copy of the bone shape is made and left in the place of the original bone, eventually to be uncovered by erosion or excavation. So notice, catastrophic burial, rapid burial by a lot of material, burying something completely and burying it deeply is necessary to fossilize something. So the fossil record is evidence of major catastrophism in the past, contrary to the idea that slow and gradual uniform processes form the earth over millions of years. Now, scientists used to argue that this fossilization process is so slow it takes thousands or millions of years to accomplish this, but empirical evidence has disproved that assumption over the last few decades. Studies from the past few decades have showed that catastrophic conditions like volcanic eruptions, when those are present, it can speed this process up. So as just a couple examples of what I'm talking about from studies over the last few decades, way back in 2004, 5 Japanese scientists published their research on rapid petrification in the secular journal called Sedimentary Geology. So they were studying mineral-rich acidic water from the explosion crater of the Tateyama volcano in central Japan, and water runs over the edge of that volcano as a waterfall, and some wood had fallen in the path of this mineral-rich water, and the wood had petrified within 36 years. And so the scientists decided to conduct further experiments and found that silica petrification could occur in just 7 years. Also the same year, 2004, a paper was published on the rapid silicification of plants at Yellowstone. Within 11 months, plants were already found to have had enough silicification that the plant tissues were stabilized against collapse and the plant structure was replicated. So again, when you have catastrophic conditions, that can make fossils, and it can make fossils fast. And the flood, of course, would have provided the perfect setting for making billions of fossils. Mudslides, lava flows would have been abundant, sediment accumulation would have been significantly accelerated, allowing for quicker and deeper deposit, and permineralization would have been much more rapid. Now, in the Bill Nye Ken Ham debate back in 2014, Bill Nye, the pseudoscience guy, squared off against creationist Ken Ham, who's the CEO of Answers in Genesis, who developed the Ark Encounter in the Creation Museum up in northern Kentucky, which I'd highly recommend you checking out. And one of the points that Bill Nye brought up several times in that debate had to do with the idea of predictions in science. He said, so far, Mr. Ham and his worldview, the creation model, does not have this capability. It cannot make predictions and show results. The big thing I want from you, Mr. Ham, is can you come up with something that you can predict? Do you have a creation model that predicts something that will happen in nature? So he's not talking about predictive prophecy, like what prophets could do and are recorded in the Bible that we've talked about some this week already. He's talking about scientific predictions. So let's say I develop a theory, and I say, I believe that there is an invisible force kind of like a big magnet, and it sucks smaller masses towards the center of larger masses, and I'm just going to call this theory gravity, okay? That's my theory, all right. So if my theory is a valid scientific theory, I should be able to make predictions based on my theory that can either be verified, right, adding support for my theory, or falsified, disproving my theory. So according to Bill Nye, creationists can't do that. We can't do legitimate science with predictions. And I have an article on our website where I give 30 different predictions based on the Bible and the biblical flood model that have been verified upon examination of the scientific evidence. But one area where creation science has provided powerful, verified scientific predictions is in reference to the fossil record. And at the same time, the fossil record effectively falsifies evolutionary theory. This is a major problem for evolution because several things that should be found in the fossil record are not found if according to the evolutionary model. So let's go ahead and look at some of that powerful evidence. I wish I had a lot more time than I do. We're going to be trying to move pretty quickly here. So first of all, evolution and the fossil record. What would we predict to find in the fossil record if evolution, as Charles Darwin defined it, is true? So most evolutionists argue that the first creatures on Earth sprang to life roughly 3.5 to 4 billion years ago. And that life would have been very simple, so single-celled organisms, and then all species then evolved from that lower life. So if naturalism and evolution are true, when we look at the general characteristics of the fossil record, what would we expect to find? We'd expect to see at the very bottom of the fossil record, so representing the very beginning of life on Earth, you'd expect to see simple, single-celled organisms. And then in the rocks above them, slightly more complex creatures that they evolved into. And then above them, slightly more complex creatures and so forth. And then in between each of those species, you'd expect to find billions upon billions of fossils from creatures that we call transitional species. So these are species transitioning into new species. So connecting the lower species in the fossil record with the next species above, showing that these turned into these over time. So there would be billions of transitional fossils between each species progression, notice on all the species in the entire planet. So fossils that form a chain of gradually evolving species up through the rock layers, eventually leading to humans. Now I say billions because if there are roughly 11 million species on the planet today, as some estimates say, and this is not to mention the multiplied millions of species that evolutionists believe existed in the past that have now gone extinct, each one of those species had to evolve from a different former species. So there should be fossils of each intermediate species between the already known distinct 11 million species that we theoretically believe exist today and the next species. Since evolutionists believe species generally live on the Earth for 1 to 11 million years each, before they each go extinct, each one of those billions of species should almost certainly be represented by multiple fossils in the fossil record. So in all, we're talking billions of transitional forms should exist. Another prediction, evolution would predict that all life is related, having evolved from previous evolutionary ancestors. So from that idea comes the tree diagrams, like the original one Darwin sketched in 1837 in one of his notebooks, and then included in depth in The Origin of Species in 1859. So the evolutionary model would predict that all life is related, however distantly, having evolved from the same original single-celled organism. So all life can fit on this single evolutionary tree. So evolution would also predict what we call diversity, to evolve before we see species disparity. Okay, so in other words, you would expect to see varieties of a single body type, diversity. That should be found lower in the fossil record. And then over time, moving up through the record, other completely new body types are going to eventually emerge, what we call disparity. So again, looking at the evolutionary tree of life, this would be the idea that twigs should begin showing up on branches before completely new branches arrive. All right, another prediction, eventual extinction of a species would be virtually guaranteed because species would be evolving into something better. And so the previous less fit species would be pushed out of the way, in favor of the new, better species. And so the older species should go extinct over time, what we call survival of the fittest. Now, we wouldn't, however, expect simultaneous worldwide mass extinction, because mass extinctions would mean that major catastrophes have affected the earth in the past, catastrophism. But evolution, remember, is based on uniformitarian thinking. So the belief that whatever we see happening today in geology, that's always happened in the same way throughout time. So since we don't see major mass extinction causing catastrophes happening today, you wouldn't predict those things to happen in the fossil record either. Now, when we look at the predictions we'd make if biblical creation is true, you'd essentially make completely opposite predictions. First of all, since fossils form from catastrophic activity, then the flood would have provided the perfect conditions for fossilization. So most fossils, therefore, likely would have been formed as a result of the flood. The pre-flood rock layers would likely, therefore, not reveal much fossilization, because much of the catastrophic activity that we see that actually forms fossils, so your volcanoes, flooding, hurricanes, are actually a result of what happened in the flood. But starting at the flood layers, you'd expect evidences of worldwide catastrophic burial. And in those layers, you'd expect to see an explosion of already fully formed creatures without any evolutionary history, because evolution didn't happen. And so no transitional forms. All right, you'd also expect both simple and complex creatures immediately from the beginning. So this is a snapshot of the death that happened during the flood. So not evolution from simple single-celled creatures. While evolution would predict diversity before disparity, the creation model would expect the opposite. So God created representatives of the distinct kinds of creatures on the planet, and representatives from each kind were also brought on the ark. And from those original proto-species, which would have been very distinct from each other at the beginning, from those would have come a lot of variety within those distinct kinds over time. So instead of the single evolutionary tree, creationists would argue that living creatures fit more of an orchard. So starting with distinct original kinds and then ending with diversity within those kinds. So disparity before diversity. So when a species' fossils appear in the fossil record, you'd expect the fossils to change very little in the rocks above them, with only diversity appearing there, since species don't evolve into completely new types of creatures. They just diversify into varieties of the same basic type of creature. Since creationists would say that most of the fossil record was formed in the flood, we'd expect the flood layers to likely, by and large, reflect possibly the progression of the flood. And according to Genesis 7:11, the flood apparently began in the ocean and then moved towards the land. So the progression of the fossil record from the bottom to the top, at least again in the flood rock layers, would probably reflect the flood's progression, starting from the sea floor and then moving upward to the ocean-dwelling creatures, to the coastlines, and finally the land. But since we're talking about a land-covering global flood where water is being pushed onto the land from oceans, you'd expect marine creature fossils, after they first appear, to be found across the planet through the rest of the flood layers above them, not merely sequestered to the sea, but mixed in with land creatures. Now, as with evolution, creationists might expect extinction, because if nothing else, humans might tend to be unwise and wipe out certain species, and humans have been on the planet from the very beginning. But unlike evolution, mass extinction would make sense to creationists, because the earth was so drastically altered by the flood that many species might no longer be well suited to the earth's post-flood environment. And so they might appear in the fossil record and then die out after the flood due to the ice age and due to hunting and due to continued catastrophic conditions. All right, so what does the fossil record actually reveal? Does it support evolution or creation? Does it falsify biblical creation? Well, there's a lot we could say on this subject again. Let's summarize it with 3 big points. Evolutionary paleontologists have identified 3 sweeping general characteristics of the fossil record. This is evolutionists themselves, this isn't creationists. Abrupt appearance, stasis, and extinction. And each of these characteristics perfectly match creationist predictions and undeniably falsify evolutionary predictions, effectively refuting evolution. So no wonder the late famous Harvard paleontologist Stephen Jay Gould, perhaps the leading paleontologist of the 20th century, he called the evolutionist fossil record dilemma an uncomfortable paradox. All right, how so? Well, the first major sweeping characteristic of the fossil record that is highlighted again by evolutionists like Stephen Jay Gould, leading paleontologists of the 20th century, is called abrupt appearance. So what do they mean by abrupt appearance? That is the idea that when a new species appears in the fossil record, it shows up on the scene abruptly, fully formed, without any clear evolutionary ancestors before it or below it in the record. So no evidence of evolutionary history. And perhaps the most obvious example of abrupt appearance is what is called by paleontologists the Cambrian explosion. So in the Cambrian rock layers, which is basically the beginning of the fossil record to all intents and purposes, there is an explosion of life, the immediate appearance of many totally different kinds of life, so disparity. So some species are simple and some aren't, and they don't have any evolutionary history. They just abruptly appear. So reporting on research at the University of Texas at Austin, UT News reported the rapid diversification known as the Cambrian explosion puzzled Charles Darwin and remains one of the biggest questions in animal evolution to this day. Very few fossils exist of organisms that could be the pre-Cambrian ancestors of bilateral animals, and even those are highly controversial, they say. American Scientist magazine acknowledged, as Darwin noted in The Origin of Species, the abrupt emergence of arthropods in the fossil record during the Cambrian presents a problem for evolutionary biology. There are no obvious simpler or intermediate forms, either living or in the fossil record, that show convincingly how modern arthropods evolved from worm-like ancestors. Consequently, there has been a wealth of speculation and contention, right? Everybody arguing. Gould admitted the Cambrian explosion was the most remarkable and puzzling event in the history of life. In fact, Gould is considered the Cambrian explosion so puzzling and such a problem for evolution that he spent the bulk of his life trying to find an evolutionary explanation for this dilemma and died never having found one. I actually talked to Kurt Wise this summer about this. He was one of Stephen Jay Gould's students, and talked to Stephen Jay Gould about this a lot. A famous evolutionary biologist of Oxford University, Richard Dawkins, he described the Cambrian explosion this way. The Cambrian strata of rocks, vintage about 600 million years, are the oldest in which we find most of the major invertebrate groups, and we find many of them already in an advanced state of evolution the very first time they appear. It's as though they were just planted there without any evolutionary history. Needless to say, this appearance of sudden planting has delighted creationists. All right, so an advanced state of evolution the first time they appear, no evolutionary history. Now, why would that delight creationists? Well, because it's exactly what we would predict to be the case if biblical creation is true. The fossil record doesn't disprove creation, it adds powerful testimony to the truth of biblical creation, that the Bible's right and evolution is false. Long ago, the late famous paleontologist of Columbia University, the American Museum of Natural History, and the Museum of Comparative Zoology at Harvard, George Gaylord Simpson, he said most new species, genera, and families in nearly all categories above the level of families appear in the records suddenly and are not led up to by known, gradual, completely transitional sequences. So the Cambrian explosion is an acknowledged problem for evolutionary theory by the leading paleontologists over the last century. This is a falsified prediction, and yet the abrupt appearance of fully formed and functional species is an obvious, pervasive trait of the entire fossil record from beginning to end. This isn't just a little side note exception that should make someone just scratch their head, some small anomaly. No, this abrupt appearance characterizes the entire fossil record according to their own words. But the abrupt appearance of living organisms in the fossil record isn't even the extent of the problem. So not only are the species of the fossil record fully formed and functional from the beginning of the record, but they also are complex when they abruptly appear. The trilobite, for example, is characteristic of the Cambrian strata at the base of the fossil record, so it's considered a trace fossil. If you find trilobites, then that is one of the things that helps them to know that must be Cambrian rock you're studying. So this is a creature that is equipped with an extremely complex vision system using aplantic lenses that are much more complex than even the human eye, which is equipped with a single refractive lens. So the fossil record provides no evidence for the evolution of the trilobite, and yet its complexity is stunning, and it is found at the base of the record, where species should be simple if evolution is true. So complexity at the very beginning of the fossil record is a falsification of a fundamental evolutionary prediction, but once again it coincides perfectly with the creation and flood predictions. Recall also that evolution would predict, remember that diversity should precede disparity in the fossil record. So in other words, varieties of a single body type, diversity, would be found in the fossil record at its base, and over time, moving up through the record, other totally different body types would eventually emerge, so disparity. And again, we call to mind the evolutionary tree of life as compared to the biblical orchard. Well, the fossil record once again supports the creationist contention. So looking broadly at all species and thinking about classification of species, I'm sure you loved that in biology when you were a kid. So biologists have pinpointed a few dozen distinct phyla on the earth. So this is the level of organization that is used to group organisms based on their basic body plans, right? There are 27 of those distinct phyla represented in the fossil record, so 27 distinct body plans. And of those 27 phyla, roughly 20 appear abruptly at the base of the fossil record during the Cambrian explosion with no evolutionary ancestors below them. So immense disparity. And variety, that is species diversity, within those phyla doesn't show up until higher in the fossil record, just as biblical creation would predict. Disparity before diversity. So abrupt appearance of fully formed and functional complex organisms with immense disparity. Again, a sweeping characteristic of the fossil record. Again, this isn't just some little anomaly. This is a general trait of the fossil record, and that truth is severely problematic for evolution, but is exactly what we'd predict to be the case if biblical creation and the flood happened. All right, so sweeping characteristic number 2 of the fossil record, according to evolutionists themselves, is what is called stasis. So stasis in the fossil record refers to the observation that after creatures appear in the fossil record, they remain virtually the same throughout their tenure in the rock layers above. So while Darwinian evolution would predict a gradual change of species over millions of years, the fossil record does not reflect that prediction. So transitional fossils linking one species to a distinctly different species, that does not exist. Gould long ago admitted evolutionists have no direct evidence for smooth transitions. He admitted, all paleontologists know that the fossil record contains precious little in the way of intermediate forms. Transitions between major groups are characteristically abrupt. So precious little intermediate forms, and even those are heavily debated among evolutionists as to whether or not they really are transitional forms. So no, abruptness is what characterizes the fossil record, not transition, not evolution. So distinct creatures that appear remain the same throughout their tenure in the fossil record other than mere varieties of the same. Writing in Paleobiology explained in apparent exasperation, the absence of fossil evidence for intermediary stages between major transitions in organic change, in organic design. Indeed, our inability, even in our imagination, to construct functional intermediates in many cases has been a persistent and nagging problem for gradualistic accounts of evolution. So an absence of fossilized species that should provide a bridge between major transitions, so the distinct types of creatures. We can't even construct in our imaginations what those species should look like, he says. So it's a major problem that has, he says, it's nagged evolutionists with persistence. The problem isn't letting up. It's not getting any better for the evolutionary worldview. And this is a telling quote. He said, the extreme rarity of transitional forms in the fossil record persists as the trade secret of paleontology. All right, so first of all, transitional forms, again, extremely rare. And again, even those are controversial among the evolutionists themselves. And that problem is a trade secret of paleontology. In other words, you don't tend to know about this problem unless you happen to be an evolutionary paleontologist, and few people are. So they don't broadcast that problem very loudly because it would highlight the fact that evolution is a house of cards. The evidence doesn't support it. So he goes on. The evolutionary trees that adorn our textbooks have data only at the tips and nodes of their branches. In other words, think about the evolutionary tree of life. So the actual fossil evidence only tells you what is at the tip of the branches and the nodes between the branches, not any of the species between those distinct species. So there are no proven transitional forms that connect the tips of the branches to the nodes. Instead, there are simply distinct types of creatures everywhere throughout the record. And yet, in spite of the evidence, they believe firmly in evolution anyway, proving themselves to have a blind faith in evolution, a willingness to draw conclusions that are not warranted by the evidence, the very definition of being irrational. So notice what he says. We don't have the fossils to connect the fossils at the tips and the nodes. The rest is inference, however reasonable, not the what? Not the evidence of the fossils. Blind faith. There's no evidence for evolution, but believe it anyway. It's an unwillingness to accept the actual evidence. The actual evidence in the fossil record is stasis. Fossils appear in the fossil record, and then the fossils of that species remain the same throughout their tenure in the fossil record. Recall that phylum is higher up in the chain and categorization of species. It represents the various groups of creatures that share the same basic body plan. Now, obviously, evolution requires that there be evolution between phyla. So one type of body plan has to be able to evolve into another type of body plan in order for there to be so many body plans now on the planet that weren't there at the beginning. But notice what evolutionary paleontologist Stephen Stanley said. The known fossil record fails to document a single example of phyletic evolution, accomplishing a major morphological transition, and hence offers no evidence that the gradualistic model can be valid. There is not a single example of evolution between phyla. So there's no evidence for gradualistic evolution, which is the kind of evolution that is, of course, accepted by the evolutionary community, Darwinian evolution. Evolutionary anthropologist and emeritus professor at the University of Oxford, Robert Barnes, acknowledged that the fossil record tells us almost nothing about the evolutionary origin of phyla and classes. Intermediate forms are non-existent, undiscovered, or not recognized. Evolutionary biologists James Valentine and Douglas Irwin wrote, "If ever we were to expect to find ancestors to or intermediates between higher taxa, it'd be in the rocks of the late Precambrian to Ordovician times," right? So jumping into the Cambrian, when the bulk of the world's higher animal taxa evolved. Yet transitional alliances are unknown or unconfirmed for any of the phyla or classes appearing then. So clear is the lack of evidence of evolutionary transition in the fossil record that evolutionary zoologist of Oxford University, Mark Ridley, he went so far as to say no real evolutionist, whether gradualistic or punctuationist, uses the fossil record as evidence in favor of the theory of evolution as opposed to special creationists. No real evolutionist is going to try to do this, because if you do, if you try to go up and debate a creationist on this, you will lose. That's what that means. Because the leading evolutionists, the ones in the know that the fossil record does not support evolution, it supports creation. The lack of transitional fossils isn't a new problem. It's been around from the very beginning of Darwinian evolution, but ignored. Charles Darwin saw this problem in the 1800s when he was developing his theory and the origin of species. Notice what he says. "The number of intermediate varieties which have formerly existed must be truly enormous. Why then is not every geological formation and every stratum full of such intermediate links? Geology assuredly does not reveal any such finely graduated organic chain. And this perhaps is the most obvious and serious objection which can be argued against this theory." So Darwin makes up his version of naturalistic evolution because he had decided in his own personal life to reject biblical creation. And he acknowledges that there is a major problem with his theory. This is a serious objection that was most obvious, that most people don't know about. and that was a lack of transitional forms. So if his theory was true, there should be transitional forms. They'd be predicted to exist, but they don't, which falsifies his theory. The theory should have been scrapped right then, but it wasn't. Why? Well, it wasn't the actual evidence. He admitted the evidence didn't support his theory. Well, with many, as it was with Darwin himself, it was because biblical creation wasn't a palatable option. And so they latched on to evolution. It didn't matter what the evidence said. So young people, keep this in mind. This debate is not about the evidence. The evidence clearly favors our side, even though it is suppressed. This isn't about evidence. This comes down to the biases that make people not want God. That's what it comes down to. The evidence is clear. Nothing has really changed since creation, has it? I mean, this really is the way man has always been. Colin Patterson literally wrote the textbook on evolution. He was the paleontologist that served as the editor of the professional journal published by the British Museum of Natural History in London. In response to a letter where somebody asked him why he didn't include examples of transitional fossils in his book, he responded, "I fully agree with your comments on the lack of direct illustration of evolutionary transitions in my book. If I knew of any, fossil or living, I would certainly have included them. Yet Gould and the American Museum people are hard to contradict when they say there are no transitional fossils. I'll lay it on the line. There is not one such fossil for which one could make a watertight argument." Now, such problems are surely why he said in a lecture that he presented at the American Museum of Natural History, "One morning I woke up and something had happened in the night. It struck me that I had been working on this stuff for 20 years and there was not one thing I knew about it." That's quite a shock to learn that one can be misled so long. Either there's something wrong with me or there's something wrong with evolution theory. He didn't know anything about evolution. Nothing had been proved. His belief in evolution remained in the realm of blind faith, not logical conclusion from the actual evidence. Notable is the fact that when paleontologists uncover a fossil that they hope will pass as a legitimate transitional form, not only is it still controversial, inevitably, but the championed fossil is inevitably from a vertebrate organism, so a creature with a backbone. So where are the invertebrate transitional forms? Now this is significant. Vertebrate fossils comprise roughly 0.0125% of the fossil record. This is way less than 1%. So if this graduated cylinder represents the fossil record, vertebrate fossils would be represented by about one droplet in this cylinder. They're virtually irrelevant indicators of whether or not evolution even occurred, since well over 99.9% of the fossil record is made up of invertebrate fossils. One would think that if evolution happened, transitional fossils would be all over the place among the invertebrates, especially since their remains, they tend to preserve more easily. But rarely, if ever, do evolutionists even claim to find alleged invertebrate transitional forms. If species evolve in the manner described by mainstream evolution, then number one, transitional forms should not be difficult to find, and number two, they should be invertebrates most of the time. Neither of those predictions hold true. Further verification that stasis reflects the fossil record comes in the form of what Darwin termed living fossils. So countless times over the years, evolutionists have discovered fossils in strata laid down millions of years ago, according to the evolutionary timeline, that were thought to be extinct, presumably from having evolved into something else, with the previous form being pushed out, selected against. So according to evolution, species are the result of descent with modification from other species. So it would be virtually inconceivable that a species would remain essentially the same after millions of years. I mean, after all, according to evolution, evolution happens, right? All right, so living fossils, however, have been discovered many times over the years. Living fossils are species thought to have lived millions of years ago and presumably gone extinct that have been discovered alive in modern times, virtually the same as their fossil counterpart. They didn't evolve over the intervening supposed millions of years. And here's just a handful of those. So are we to believe that evolution happens when we find coelacanths today and they look like their fossil counterpart that was thought to have gone extinct 300 to 400 million years ago? Or the modern horseshoe crab that matches its fossil counterpart that's supposed to be 400 million years old? So once again, the predictions of the evolutionary paradigm fall woefully short when you ignore the claims of evolutionists and look at the actual evidence. So stasis is a verified prediction of the creation model, not the evolutionary paradigm. A lack of transitional fossils, especially among the invertebrates, along with the prevalence of living fossils, supports creation, not evolution. All right, sweeping characteristic number 3. Recall that if evolution is true, we would predict that extinction would be mandatory. Species are supposed to evolve, and the more fit variation should force the less fit varieties to die out. If they don't die out, then they must not have been less fit. So why did they need to evolve in the first place? So living fossils are powerful testimony that the evolutionary paradigm does not fit the evidence. But another issue comes in the form of mass extinctions. So while extinctions are predicted by evolution, mass extinctions, where high percentages of the Earth's species are wiped out for some mysterious reason, that doesn't fit, because that suggests phenomena that are so catastrophic that the entire world had to have been affected. And that doesn't fit with the uniformitarian assumption that undergirds evolutionary biology and geology. And yet 5 mass extinction events are said to have occurred over the last 450 million years, according to the evolutionary paradigm, where huge percentages of the species on the planet are said to have gone extinct by some kind of unknown worldwide catastrophe. So in the Ordovician extinction, supposedly 445 million years ago, 60 to 70% of the Earth's species are thought to have gone extinct. In the Devonian extinction, 360 to 375 million years ago, up to 75% of the Earth's species disappeared from the Earth. The Permian extinction, 252 million years ago, 95% of the Earth's species went extinct. The Triassic extinction, 200 million years ago, 70 to 80% of the Earth's species disappeared. In the Cretaceous extinction, 65 to 66 million years ago, 75% of the Earth's species went extinct. So the cause of these massive world-affecting extinctions are unknown, although the last one is argued by some to be from a massive meteorite that struck the Earth off the coast of Mexico, the Chicxulub crater there. But again, if such major worldwide extinction events are true, then catastrophism, not uniformitarianism, fits the geologic evidence, which is what we'd predict. So evolutionists may not like our particular worldwide extinction event, but they can't very well argue against catastrophism and still believe in 5 worldwide catastrophes and not even know what caused them. I mean, for all they know, it was a global flood. So why are they so adamantly against that particular catastrophe when they don't even have an alternative option? Well, I think we know why. The fossil record is saturated with evidences of catastrophic conditions being at play in the past. Fossil graveyards, technically called Lagerstätten, are found all over the world throughout the fossil record, where large numbers of animals were buried rapidly by some sort of catastrophic event. I had the opportunity to excavate dinosaur fossils in one such graveyard in Wyoming, where an estimated 5,000 dinosaurs had been killed, torn to bits, transported some distance, and then rapidly dumped and buried in this single ranch in Wyoming. Imagine the catastrophic conditions that would be necessary to do that, especially when we're not talking about little rats, little tiny mice. We're talking about dinosaurs. We're talking T-Rex, Admonosaurs, Triceratops, Pachycephalosaurus. Polystrate fossils, these are fossils that span more than one strata, again found all over the world as well, from trees and calamites to catfish and even whales. Aspiration fossils have been found where fish died rapidly, choking on their dinner. In a famous ichthyosaur fossil, you find that this enormous sea creature was killed and buried in the middle of giving birth. Many fossils show evidence of rapid burial. We're talking catastrophic activity, as would be predicted if the flood happened. While dinosaurs are rarely found articulated, so this is where their bones are together in the positions they would have been in life, when they are found that way, rarely, Again, that's a rare thing for them to be found articulated, but when you find them that way, they tend to be found oftentimes in a position called the epistotonic death posture. So their heads are thrown back, their tails are curved forward, sometimes their mouths are open as though they're gasping for breath. And this posture is understood by paleontologists to be evidence of catastrophic death by drowning. Bioturbation is the process that occurs today where the top few feet of soil are constantly being reworked by burrowing organisms. So organisms that will eat and excrete soil in trees and so forth, worms doing what they do. So this process today eliminates layering. So bioturbation is why you don't see distinct layering in your backyard when you look at a hole that your 6-year-old dug. And yet we do see distinct layering in the rock layers that's very prevalent in the Paleozoic and Mesozoic rock layers, so your flood rock layers. So the thin layering of the rock strata found all over the world is evidence of catastrophic deposition of the geologic column and therefore the fossil record, because bioturbation occurs today under uniform conditions. But it clearly didn't happen in the past since we see distinct layering. So thin layering forms from catastrophic deposition of sediment. We know that because we see it in response to, for example, the Mount St. Helens eruptions that have happened over the last few decades. The distinct unbioturbated rock layers of the earth are evidence of totally different conditions in the past, conditions in which rapid deposition didn't provide enough time for normal bioturbation to occur. Between the mass extinction found throughout the fossil record and the many fossil examples that require catastrophic conditions, clearly catastrophism is a major characteristic of the fossil record. All right, we're about to wrap it up here. How would creationists explain these 5 separate extinction events instead of just one from the flood? Well, we would interpret the same supposed extinction data differently in a way that actually doesn't cause the dilemma that evolutionists are left with. First of all, the dates of these extinction events are incorrect because they rely on radiometric dating. So all dates in millions of years can be telescoped to the biblical time frame when you realize that, for example, the nuclear decay rates were apparently accelerated during the flood. So to creationists, the flood likely corresponds to roughly the Cambrian through the Cretaceous periods. So the 540 million year ago mark up to 66 million years ago in radiometric years. So each of these extinction events, notice, fit within the year-long flood that occurred a few thousand years ago. So most of the geologic column and the fossil record provide an account of what we think is the flood's progression. So each of the major extinction events that are noted by evolutionists likely report the destruction of another of Earth's major habitats or ecosystems as the waters of the flood continue to rise. So the flood apparently began at the base of the ocean floor, Genesis 7:11. So the creatures at the base of the record are what you'd expect to find. They are creatures that lived on the ocean floor. Then as the flood progressed from the ocean floor, it started picking up your swimming creatures and then moved towards coastal habitats and picked up amphibians and then into continental habitats with reptiles and finally some birds and mammals. And as an entire ecosystem or habitat was destroyed, the creatures from that ecosystem, they no longer show up in the higher rock layers because those layers represent the next habitat with their own plants and animals. The obvious exception are the marine creatures. So once marine creatures appear in the fossil record, they continue to appear in all the rock layers above, just as you'd predict if the flood happened. So the flood pushed marine creatures onto the continents, and their fossils are found in the middle of continents, way away from coasts, and that's significant. So evolutionists would have to say that, well, continents must have once been the ocean floor. They must have been down there on the ocean floor, and that's why there are marine creatures on them. The problem is, again, you look at the actual evidence, continental rock is made of granite. This is a completely different kind of rock than what ocean floor rock is, which is made of basalt. So continental rock, this granite is more like a cork. It floats higher in the mantle. And the ocean floor made of basalt is more dense and it sinks relative to the continents. So the only way to get water way up from the ocean and over the continents is if the sea level rises high enough to flood the continents. So bottom line, the fossil record is not a record of life over billions of years as evolution would predict. It's a record of death by habitat and the year-long devastating worldwide flood recorded in the Bible. So the fossil record isn't about life, it's about death. It's a graveyard. The flood was so catastrophic in its effects on the earth that some species never recovered after the flood and went extinct due to the completely new environment that was created by the flood, including the Ice Age, which would have begun soon after the flood. So regardless of one's explanation of the evidence, extinction, not evolution, is a major trait of the fossil record. The biblical global flood provides a powerful explanation for this sweeping trait of the record for why worldwide death and extinction occurred in the fossil record. So does the fossil record disprove God's existence? No, actually, it provides even more powerful evidence for creation and the flood. In my opinion, some of the most powerful evidences for creation and the flood. And again, I wish I had time to discuss other evidences like from the geologic column. There's a lot that we could say about that in addition to the fossil record, but we're out of time. So thank you for your attention.